Good afternoon, everyone. I was about to say good morning, actually, but no, we are in the afternoon. Great that you can join us. Apologies again for having to reschedule from last week. We still don't entirely know what went wrong with the registrations, but thank you for joining us this week anyway. Wow, what a week. What with further lockdown restrictions and the US elections, it's a bit of a crazy time. But that said, Brexit waits for none of that. It's still pressing ahead. So we've got quite a lot to cover today around preparations for importing from the 1st of January. So let's crack on. So we're going to run through, for those of you that haven't joined a webinar, we're going to have a quick run through what the EU Exit Support Programme is. We're going to look at now and beyond the 31st of December, and we're going to look at Brexit and its impact. And then importantly, we're going to cover off considerations and practical steps for you guys to make sure that you're optimally prepared for the changes that are coming into place. And then, as with all of our webinars, there are some 2 or 3 pages at the end with signposting to additional sources of information and support. As we go through, if you've got any questions, just pop them in the Q&A box, and then once we're finished, then I'll go over those. If there's anything that's particularly specific to your organisation, or you've got particular vulnerabilities that you want to cover, then it might be quite good to book a one-to-one session where we can go through those and you'll get a kind of tailored action plan for your business. But let's crack on anyway. So the EU Exit Support Programme, we've got a host of webinars that are running up to Christmas and beyond. The ones up to Christmas are very much EU exit focused, but then we've got ones that focus more on export and expanding overseas and so on come the turn of the year, trying to put a more positive spin on all of this. As I mentioned, running alongside the webinar, there is a one-to-one support provision where we work with you over the course of 3 hours and we deliver a dedicated one-to-one action plan for you. So detailing everything that you need to do that's very specific to your unique circumstances. The way to book these is the usual Eventbrite link. Anybody that wants a copy of these slides after this, just pop us an email and we'll get these out to you. So now and beyond the 31st of December. So I always talk about, a little bit about our EU membership and the kind of things that it's delivered for us. So in addition to the 4 pillars of freedom that have benefited our trade and our skills and our education, we've seen a number of other EU initiatives and directives. And to be honest, we've often been at the forefront of those, but they've served to better us as a nation. We've seen significant advancements in consumer rights and benefits, as well as benefits for our national security. And actually, foreign direct investment into the UK has effectively doubled since the creation of the EU single market, as we've been kind of regarded as the gateway to Europe, if you like. But we voted to leave, and effectively we left on the 31st of January. So now, as the 2 sides take it down to the wire in terms of agreeing a trade deal, we still face the uncertainty of a potential no deal. So, what does this potentially look like? So as I say, we left the EU on the 31st of January. The withdrawal agreement was ratified on the 23rd of Jan, and the EU gave its consent on the 29th of January. So we've effectively left the European Union. But because of the transition period that was negotiated, we've obviously seen EU law has continued to apply. Our EU and UK content continues to count towards origin protocols. And we've still continued our membership of the single market and the customs union. I suppose that the biggest things that have changed is kind of, which we wouldn't necessarily as kind of consumers see, but we're no longer represented in the multitude of EU institutions, agencies and bodies, but to us that hasn't made a huge impact. But to all intents and purposes, our life has continued as it would do as a member of the EU, and as traders, we've continued to use the common external tariff. We've not had to make declarations on our imports or exports, and of course our access to that EU trading landscape has continued. Now, The transition period does end on the 31st. The UK government declined to extend it when they had the opportunity in June. So as of the 1st of January, we become a third country in the eyes of the EU. So we cease to have access to the single market and the customs union. We will not be party to any of the free trade agreements that the EU has negotiated across the world. And our customs declarations become mandatory. So the amount of administration involved in shipping goods to and from the EU increases exponentially. There will be a lot more documentation requirements, more border checks, more controls, more inspections on goods coming in from the EU and from the UK going into the EU. So there's a lot that changes from the 1st of January, and it's important as importers that you're fully prepared for that. You know, in the past, we haven't had to supply the kind of documentation to clear our goods at import, whereas we're going to have to moving forward, because EU goods will be considered third country goods at UK border controls. So it's important that you understand the documentation requirements for your goods, and you calculate the customs value of your goods accurately to make sure that those goods aren't held up at customs. I always kind of cover off the trading landscape as well, because I think this picture illustrates the current state of play and the different levels of agreement the bloc has with countries and other trading blocs. As part of the EU, and obviously during the transition period, we've continued to have access to these arrangements. There are essentially three types. So we've got the notion of customs union agreements, like we have with Turkey. So that's where we eliminate customs duties in bilateral trade and kind of establish a joint customs tariff for foreign importers. Then we've got association agreements, stabilisation agreements, free trade agreements, and economic partnership agreements, all of which you'll have heard throughout the Brexit discussions. They're where both parties remove or reduce the customs tariffs in bilateral trade. And then you've got partnership and cooperation agreements. But on the 1st of January 2021, the UK will no longer have access to what is over 77 countries with a variety of negotiated agreements, facilitating that kind of frictionless bilateral trade. And it won't have access to the further 24 in the process of being ratified or the 6 being negotiated. So every government involved in international trade is seeking to serve two purposes: to protect its own domestic market, but also to develop arrangements with other countries where they can have frictionless trade for traders, so that traders can expand overseas. And I think it's quite important to look at, you know, what the trading landscape looks like for us as of the 1st of January. So actually this number has increased. It's 22 rolled over trade deals. If you think about it, the UK was technically unable to negotiate new trade deals until the transition period, and even then those agreements obviously can't come into effect until transition periods end, i.e. the 1st of January. But so far the government has agreed 22 deals, or like rollover deals or continuity agreements, covering over 50 countries. However, these nations represent actually what is now a little bit over 10% of our trade, if you like. We've obviously got the new UK-Japan deal, which is great news for the automotive sector, where their complex supply chains and manufacturing are so inextricably linked. That's great news for them. But overall, it doesn't compensate for the fact that if we're to face the 1st of January without a deal, then some 90% of our trade will be done under WTO terms, and that's not really where we want it to be. But regardless, we have to prepare. So in terms of Brexit and its impact, so effectively we left the EU on the 31st of January, but our trade with the EU and beyond has been largely unaffected throughout this period. But as of the 1st of January, as I said, we become a third country in the eyes of the EU. So the number of customs formalities increases, which means that you as businesses have to present more documents and submit more information to customs authorities. So if your company has been trading with markets outside of the EU, you'll be familiar with these kind of customs and clearance formalities. However, some companies have only ever dispatched unacquired goods into free circulation within the EU. So the change is considerable, and many remain unprepared, even though we've got less than kind of 60 days to go. So looking at those extra formalities and considerations relating to the UK and EU trade, companies are going to have to understand what documentary requirements might apply to their products when imported from the EU. They're similarly going to have to understand the processes at the UK and EU borders in the case of export, but at the UK borders, and what kind of checks and inspections will be applicable to their goods. Obviously, duty and import VAT becomes applicable to EU goods entering the UK market, which has impacts for both affordability and cash flow, as well as compliance as companies determine the correct valuation of their imports and ensure they pay the right amount of duty and import VAT to HMRC. So quite often when you're importing goods, and you'll be familiar with this if you're importing from the rest of the world, but quite often when you're importing goods, the amount of duty and import VAT that you pay is not necessarily based on what's on the commercial invoice. There are other things that need to be factored into that. So that's your customs valuation. And it's important that companies get their head around what's involved with that. Customs Notice 252 is an excellent source of information on customs valuation. But companies will also need to understand if their goods are being subject to export or import licensing controls. Companies will have to familiarise themselves with UK regulation governing the goods they're importing, so that they can understand what documentation needs to accompany their goods and what kinds of kind of physical and documentary examination might be undertaken at the UK border. So that awareness allows UK companies to guide their EU suppliers, which is really important. So you can be talking to your EU suppliers about what you believe is required to clear your goods locally here, and collaborate with them to help prevent unnecessary delays when the goods arrive here in the UK. If you haven't started to already, start to approach and discuss options with your EU suppliers for mitigating the risks of any delays should the ports become overwhelmed. We're never ones to advocate huge stock buffers, but it might be sensible to create a moderate stock buffer. I think there's been a huge amount of work done at the UK ports to prepare for this in quite challenging circumstances, obviously with COVID as well. I think, I don't want to predict this, but I suspect that it will be the southern ports that become more overwhelmed than the northern ports. So I think it's important to understand the route of your goods and plan accordingly. You'll need to consider cash flow issues as import duty becomes payable to goods imported from the EU, and in some cases it's payable before the goods are released to you. So there are options to defer that duty and that import VAT, but if you don't have a duty deferment account, for example, then you need to consider other payment options with HMRC and how they impact on cash flow. The pound has been incredibly volatile since Brexit was first announced way back in 2016, seems like a lifetime ago now. Should we part ways with the EU without a deal, I think we can expect further volatility. So start thinking of ways you can protect against those foreign exchange fluctuations, like maybe currency hedging, for example. Okay, so considerations and kind of practical steps. So it's been quite difficult up until early this year for companies to effectively plan for Brexit, but there's a lot more certainty now, and it's important to recognise that many of the changes will be implemented regardless of whether there's a trade agreement signed. So we're going to look at a few of those areas today, and if you haven't already started to look at, you should be looking at. So we're going to cover off the new border operating model, which talks about, the implementation of new border controls at UK borders affecting EU goods coming in. We're going to discuss the Northern Ireland Protocol and how that impacts. We're going to discuss the new UK global trade tariff that effectively replaces the common external tariff. So we have visibility of the import duties that will be applied to our goods. Talk a little bit about the URI numbers. Obviously, you will be familiar with UK URI numbers, but is there a certain circumstance where you actually might need both? Commodity codes and binding tariff informations. Commodity codes become supremely important now to make sure that we're properly declaring our goods. So that correct classification of your imports is really important. And you can't always rely on your suppliers to get it right. And you do have, as the importer of record, that ability to change a commodity code on your import declaration if you believe that to use the supplier's commodity code would leave you uncompliant in HMRC's eyes. We'll talk a little bit about import preference. So where you can import goods at a reduced or zero rate of duty. Talk about entries and documentation, a little bit about special procedures and how you can, perhaps in certain circumstances, get relief on duty or VAT, or perhaps suspend that duty or VAT depending on the circumstances that you're importing those goods. We'll talk a little bit about valuation, which I touched on earlier, import duty and VAT, and regulatory compliance, and a little bit about Incoterms. So understanding the contracts that you've got in place with your suppliers at the moment, and whether the Incoterms that you're using are leaving you overly exposed, and whether there might be reason to renegotiate those. And then we'll touch on authorised economic operator status as well, which is quite an interesting one for those of you who import frequently and want to gain that accreditation, which would give you a certain kite mark, a certain status, but also allows you a certain amount of autonomy with regard to your customs management, if you like, but we'll touch on it later on. So as I said, there's more clarity around now. So in July, the government announced its 200+ page document entitled the Border Operating Model. It's just been updated this month again, so there's even more clarification there. But it essentially lays out, you lucky people, you have a phased approach to import declarations, as exporters don't. Exporters are to kind of grapple with and get their heads around their requirements from day one in January. But as importers, you have a little bit of flexibility. So the new border operating model effectively lays out a phased approach to the implementation of full border controls on imports. So those goods coming into GB from the EU. I think the government's quite open about the fact that the phasing in is due to the impact of COVID on businesses and their level of preparedness for the new trading requirements. So the phasing is really, really important. I won't go into too much detail as it's a huge topic, it's quite heavy, and we've already run a separate webinar exclusively on the topic, which you're welcome to obtain the recording for that. But I do want to pick out a couple of key points, and they're paramount in terms of preparing for next year. So there are 3 dates in the phased approach. There's the 1st of January, 1st of April, then 1st of July. In phase 1, importers of standard goods, so those companies that are importing, say, clothes through to electronics, will need to cover basic customs requirements, so keeping records, accounting for VAT and so on, but they'll have up to 6 months to complete the customs declaration. So import duty is payable from the 1st of January, but that can be deferred until the declaration's made. So that helps enormously with cash flow and as you grapple with the new process. UK safety and security declarations aren't required for those first 6 months as well, so that's really good. However, importers of controlled and excise goods, they don't get that deferment or that phasing in. They'll need to make standard customs declarations for the 1st of January. There'll be physical checks for all high-risk live animals and plants, and a requirement to pre-notify for certain movements, but they'll not at that point be required to move through a border control post, which we'll be moving towards that. So, by July, all goods of that ilk will have to go through a border control post. Second phase in April, so all products of animal origin. So products like meat, honey, milk, eggs, and all regulated plants and plant products will also require pre-notification and the relevant health documentation, which is important. Any physical checks will continue to be conducted at the point of destination, so they won't at that point be routed through any border control posts either. But then by July, we see the phasing in complete. So that means that traders moving any goods will have to make full customs declarations. Any traders that have deferred their customs declarations, so those traders of standard goods, will have had to have made their supplementary declarations by the 1st of July, and any import duty and VAT becomes payable at that point. But like I say, by July, that phasing in is complete. So all traders moving any goods will have to make full customs declarations at the point of importation and pay those relevant tariffs. All imports subject to sanitary and phytosanitary controls will have to be presented at border control posts, so the ports are getting geared up for that. And there'll be an increase in physical checks and actually the taking of samples. So sanitary and phytosanitary checks for animals, plants and their products will take place at those border control posts and not actually at the destination. So there's a lot of change, and you can quite easily see why there's that 6 months phasing in that's really important. So what are the implications for you as importers? Well, as an importer, you'll have to complete customs declarations to clear your goods at UK customs. Any customs duties applicable to your goods under the new UK global tariff, which we're going to have a look at in a bit, they'll need to be paid. So you'll need to determine the origin, the classification and the customs value of your goods. And as I said earlier, there are options available to defer any payment that's due, which will help enormously. VAT, so import VAT will be levied on goods from the EU, so that will follow the same rates and structures that are applied to rest of the world imports. So if you're importing from the rest of the world, you'll be familiar with that. If you're VAT registered, you'll be able to use postponed VAT accounting to account for that VAT, which again is good. But if you're not VAT registered, then you'll have the same options available to report and pay import VAT as you already would for customs duties, for example. Full safety and security declarations will need to be made. You need to know what documentation is needed to clear your goods at customs, any licensing or certificates. And then there are additional requirements that affect only specific goods movements. So foodstuffs, for example, they'll need special certification to enter the country via specific locations, and they have to undergo additional checks at the border. Those kind of products are things like those covered by international conventions, so endangered species of wild fauna or flora, any goods that are subject to sanitary or phytosanitary controls, goods with additional customs requirements like excise goods, and any other goods that have, say, could be considered as strategic exports. So they're special goods that require those additional controls, if you like. Collection of interest VAT data. So HMRC is asking that all VAT registered importers currently required to submit those Interstat arrivals declarations, so those companies over that 1.5 million threshold, that they continue submitting those just until the end of December next year, though, so there is light at the end of the tunnel, that exporters don't have to do Interstat from the 1st of January next year, but importers do just until the end of next year. So again, it's a huge topic. It warranted a completely separate webinar, but hopefully I've provided a bit of an overview. There's so much more clarity now around those kind of border controls and checks to help us prepare. But if you are in a situation where you think that these are going to impact you and you want to have more of a kind of dedicated, customized action plan, then just get in touch and we can book a one-to-one with you and go through all the finer details. The Northern Ireland Protocol, so you'll remember that's the protocol which was really responsible for breaking the deadlock in the withdrawal agreement last year. So although it's not ideal, it serves to create a legal border down the Irish Sea. So the overriding principle was always to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland and to provide that kind of, how did Johnson refer to, unfettered access to GB for Northern Ireland businesses. But depending on where the goods are moving to and from, they'll be treated slightly differently. So for example, trade coming from Northern Ireland to GB, there'll be no additional processes, paperwork or restrictions. Trade going to Northern Ireland for GB, however, might face tariffs if the goods are ultimately entering Ireland rather than staying in Northern Ireland in the UK customs territory. There won't be tariffs levied on goods remaining within the UK customs territory. So it's only if those goods are moving on to Ireland, so they're transiting through Northern Ireland. There'll be undoubtedly additional processes on goods arriving in Northern Ireland for those products such as animal and plant plants or agri-food goods, warranting those special checks and controls. So these will be implemented in border control posts within the Northern Irish ports, and I know that they're gearing up furiously for this, additional burden, if you like. VAT is always a tricky area, but never more so than in the Northern Ireland Protocol. So essentially, Northern Ireland remains aligned with EU VAT and excise rules for goods, but remains part of the UK's VAT and excise system. It's all a bit of a all a lot to get your head around, really. But essentially, you will see increasingly reference to GB and Northern Ireland rather than UK, because the Northern Ireland Protocol does differentiate between those two territories, if you like. So essentially, how it should work is that Northern Ireland goods entering the GB territory, you'll not face any customs checks or controls or anything like that. However, goods leaving GB for Northern Ireland could be subject to declarations, checks, approvals, and maybe duties if the goods are destined for Southern Ireland. So companies selling into both Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland need to understand what their obligations are. So I wanted to touch on the new UK global tariff. So this replaces the EU Common External Tariff, and it applies to goods you import from the 1st of January. It compares, quite helpfully, the new tariff with the Common External Tariff, so you can check the difference between what you pay now, maybe on your rest of the world imports, and what you'll pay on everything from the 1st of January. In quite a lot of circumstances, there's been a slight simplification of duty. So some importers might say that they're, saving, I don't know, 0.5, 2.5%. I suppose it doesn't make up for the fact that we're having to pay import duty on everything really now, but hey ho. There are a couple of exceptions to when the tariff applies. So, for example, when you're importing from a developing country that pays less or no duty because it's part of the generalised system of preference. So those GSP nations, those developing countries where we as Western economies have agreed to zero rate or reduce the amount of duty that we pay on those goods to help boost their economies. So that will continue. That's a WTO initiative. It's not an EU initiative, so it's not impacted by Brexit. So if you're importing any goods from those preference countries, those GSP countries, then that will continue. Other examples of where the tariff wouldn't apply would be when they're from a country that has a trade agreement with the UK. So for example, UK and Japan. So moving forward, bringing products in from Japan, they won't have tariffs applied to them. And then there might be a situation where we have a relief or tariff suspension that's operated by us for products coming in from certain countries. You'll still need to refer to the UK trade tariff, which is a separate database, at least in the immediate term, for finding things like your commodity codes, preference details, VAT quotas, and any conditions like certificates, licensing, proof of origin, and so on, just until the government gets to merge the two systems. But we now have firm data on which to build our cost and margin scenarios, which is very welcomed. I wanted to touch on EORI numbers. So historically, if your business has been involved in the import of commercial goods from outside the EU, then you'll have required an EORI number anyway. The EORI number acts as a kind of means of providing security and statistic in international trade, and it's used by customs authorities like HMRC to identify traders or economic operators and in the exchange of data with other government departments. So it's kind of like your unique identifier, if you like. Last year, as we peered over the side of a cliff and looked no deal in the eyes, UK firms were urged to apply for an EORI number as part of no deal preparations and to secure that kind of ongoing UK-EU trade. It's highly unlikely you don't have one. And as I say, all UK businesses dealing with the rest of the world will have one. If, however, you don't, it's a 12-digit number that starts with GB. And if you're VAT registered, it'll also include your VAT number. It's a unique and essential identifier that features on your import documentation, sorry. So you need to apply via the Gov website and the links provided later in the slides. Some companies will require an EU EORI number in addition to their UK EORI number, depending on the Incoterms they're using with their EU counterparts. So most EU-UK trade has been historically done door-to-door on a kind of ex-works or equivalent of DDP basis, delivered duty paid, which has been fine when goods are in free circulation and not subjected to customs formalities or any border checks. However, if you're importing your goods under ex-works, That's to say that your suppliers simply make their goods available to you at their premises, and you're responsible for the export declaration moving forward and carriage and so on. You'll need an EORI number, as it will be you that's interfacing with the local customs office rather than your supplier. So that's something to bear in mind. Commodity codes. So you'll all likely be familiar with your commodity codes, sometimes referred to HS codes, tariff codes, but they're all the same thing. Essentially, they are 10 digits long for import and 8 digits long for export. These are codes standardized under the World Customs Organization harmonized system for the first 6 digits. So meaning really that the first six digits of your product should be the same regardless of country. The UK will remain a participating country in this scheme. The harmonised system allows additional digits to be set by customs authorities. So, for example, currently numbers 7 and 8 are set by the EU as part of its common external tariff, and then figures 9 and 10 are set by us here in the UK. Tariff codes sometimes extend beyond 10 digits. In the case of cap goods, for example, they can go up to 14 digits. It's essential that you familiarise yourself with your commodity codes and check them against the UK trade tariff. Do not take it for granted that your supplier is using the correct code. You could be importing goods that are incorrectly classified and could be underpaying or overpaying, in fact, import duty and VAT. So goods coming into the UK will be subjected to increased scrutiny and checks, and the correct classification of your goods is your legal responsibility. Essentially, everything hangs off the commodity code. They're required for all customs declarations, so they dictate the internal taxes and duties, they determine whether a proof of origin is required, they feed into those all-important trade statistics, they determine whether the goods need any certification or licensing, and they feed into valuation monitoring, and importantly as well provide details of any sanctions, embargoes or restrictions on those goods in relation to a particular country, so you know where you can import from and where you can't. It's essential that you check them, as the wrong codes, as I say, can result in incorrect payment of duty, which you don't want to be doing, incorrect filing of paperwork, failure to obtain the correct supporting information or documentation, so your goods can be held up. So the commodity codes are so important. Subscribe to updates with HMRC, because the tariff is an organic system. It's, new commodity codes are coming out all the time. I've provided the links at the back of the presentation. And if in doubt, consult with HMRC. So they have an email tariff classification service where you can email them with what you believe is your commodity code, and they'll come back to you with a non-legally binding opinion on that. So that's a good service to use if in doubt. Taking it to the next level, in the case where a product's commodity code is questionable and you want absolute assurance that you're fully compliant with all of the requirements that product dictates, you can apply for a binding tariff information, or what we call a BTI. When granted, it's a legally binding document, if you like, on all UK and EU customs administrations, and it's generally valid for 3 years. So it just helps give you that peace of mind around your customs duties, licensing requirements, quotas, and other restrictions. It's good in those occasions where you're really not sure. Import preference. So you may or may not be familiar with the Generalised System of Preference Scheme, or GSP. But as I said earlier, it's a scheme that's really designed to promote trade between developed and developing markets. So the idea is to make those products from developing countries more attractive to developed nations through either reducing or zero rating the import tariff, so as to increase the kind of export earnings of those developing markets and promote their industrialization or accelerate their rates of economic growth. There are 3 GSP schemes in operation. So there's the standard GSP, where low and middle income countries are granted partial or full removal of customs duties on 2/3 of their tariff lines. You've then got everything but arms, or EBA, where least developed countries are granted duty-free, quota-free access to the EU single market for all products except for arms and ammunition. And then finally, GSP Plus. So that gives special incentives like zero duty on all goods to vulnerable, low and middle income countries that can demonstrate kind of good governance and advances in sustainable development. So there are 3 different types of GSP. As I said earlier, the UK continues to be part of this scheme once outside the EU. So These schemes cover almost 5,000 products and help 129 beneficiary countries. So as an importer of goods from one or several of these countries, you'll need to obtain proof of origin from your supplier in the form of a GSP certificate of origin, and you'll need to include the right preference code in your C88 or import declaration in order to have that preferential rate applied to your goods. But preference continues even once we're out of the UK, the EU even. Import entries and documentation. So companies that have exclusively traded within the EU will be new to the C88 or the single administrative document. We like to call it a SAD document, which is used for declaring imports and exports actually to HMRC. I'd advocate you obtain training to better understand this form and its requirements, or you seek the services of Good Agent, as this will be your customs import entry moving forward, bringing goods into the EU. There are in excess of 60 data boxes on the form in total, but required data fields vary on the type of entry, type of goods, and the customs procedure applied. There are more fields to complete for import entry than an export entry. The actual paper version of the C88 looks a little bit overwhelming, but bearing in mind you'll be making import declarations using software that kind of guides you through the process. I always find myself stressing this: the customs import entry is a legal requirement for all import shipments, so you must provide HMRC with a full documentation or full information, about you, the importer, and the products you're importing before your goods can be processed and released. Entry errors, however innocent, can lead to back payment of duty with interest, and more serious errors can lead to financial and civil penalties. So really, really important those declarations are correct. Ultimately, the buck stops with you, the importer. So the accuracy of customs import entries, is your legal responsibility, even if it's your forwarder who makes the error. Okay. In addition to customs declarations, there are several documents that are involved in the shipment of goods, and some in the actual clearance of goods. So you'll have your invoices, obviously, which is your commercial invoice, which has a full description of the item's value and the terms or proposed terms of the sale, etc. You'll have your packing list. This is really a detailed document that states all of the product and packaging details contained in the shipment, and your supplier has to create a compliant packing list document to be used by all of the parties in the supply chain and to be accessed by UK customs at the border. Origin certificates. So these certificates can be mandatory and requested for political reasons or trade policy reasons, like say when there's quota involved. You'll need to check your commodity code to see whether your imported goods need to be accompanied by a certificate of origin. Then you've got preference documents. So these documents certify that the goods you're importing are subject to reduced tariffs, so just like we talked about the GSP proof of origin earlier. So reduced tariffs or exemptions. What else to say about those, really? I suppose going back to the slide about our free trade landscape from the 1st of January, it's relatively limited. So it's likely that the main preference certificates you'll see will be from those GSP nations until we start to build up our free trade agreements across the globe. But if you are importing under preference, you'll need to make sure that your supplier provides a preference certificate for your import declaration, and also to accompany the goods if you're going to claim that reduced or zero rate of tariff. Health certificates, so veterinary certificates called export health certificates, dealt with by a vet. These will be a requirement for food and animal products brought into the UK. So for example, meat, pet food, hides, and so on. You've also got certificates of conformity. So some products imported into the UK will have to prove that they conform with certain standards. For example, some fruit and vegetables will need to meet UK standards to be imported into the UK. Licenses. There are, if you think about it, 3 types of control on goods. There are bans, where there's no import or export allowed. There are quotas, when the volume of imported goods is restricted. And then there's surveillance, where the import and export of goods is monitored with licenses. So you'll need to determine whether your imported goods need to be accompanied by an import license. Import licenses are needed for military and dual-use goods as standard, but look at your commodity code and the tariff and understand whether the goods that you're importing require a specific license. Customs special procedures. So under the Union Customs Code, we have what are called customs special procedures that are split into storage, special use, or processing. Now, they're mainly designed to reduce the level of customs duty you pay or delay when that duty becomes payable, which can obviously be quite valuable to your business in a wide range of ways, not least being cash flow. I've listed the most common special procedures here, and which you will use depend on what you're trying to achieve and how the goods are to be used. For example, inward processing would work for products that were being processed within the UK, but then later exported outside of the UK. So they're never actually released into free circulation. They're processed, or they undergo a level of manufacturing here in the UK and then they're re-exported out. Or if you're simply bringing in goods for an exhibition, then the temporary admission could apply. So a good customs clearance agent or freight forwarder will be able to help you navigate your way through these procedures and help select the one that works best for you under your particular circumstance. But it's important to know that they exist. Customs procedure codes, so they're kind of linked. So unless you've been bringing goods in from outside the EU, you're likely to be unfamiliar with customs procedure codes, but they're very important codes as they tell customs in a shorthand way why you're importing your goods, and they serve to kind of denote the simplified procedure of your goods if you've applied for any of the ones that I've just mentioned before. So they describe the procedure that your goods are moving from and into. Now, these CPCs, as we call them, identify which of the customs and excise regimes I referred to on the previous slide have been applied and are going to be applied. It's based on a 2-digit community code that identifies the customs procedure, for example, removal from a warehouse or entry to free zone, export, under outward processing, etc. And then from there, it's built into a 7-digit code. So a standard import CPC code, those of you that are already completing import declarations, you'll be familiar as 400000, whereas goods entering a customs or bonded warehouse would be 7100000. So you become familiar with the customs procedure codes that are applied to your goods. But they're really important codes, really important that you get them right. They're a core entry on your import declaration, and there are some 350 code combinations for import. So it's important that you get your head around what they are, and typically you'll be using the same ones time and time again. Okay, valuation. So we touched upon this earlier. So from the 1st of January, if we don't reach an agreement with the EU, all our goods entering the UK will cease to be acquisitions, if you like, and instead they'll be imports. And as such, they'll be subject to import duty. So valuation is the process of assigning a customs value to your goods so that the correct level of duty and VAT can be applied. As discussed, import duties from third countries can be found against your products commodity code in the new UK global tariff. Now, there are 6 valuation methods you can use, but 90% of the businesses across the globe use method 1, which requires you to add the cost of freight and insurance to the value of your goods, which gives you the CIF price, the cost insurance freight price, and it's on that the duty is calculated. Then VAT's calculated on the total amount. The more you do of these valuations, the more used you'll become to the working, so don't stress too much. I've provided a link to Notice 252, which explains the valuation methods and their requirements, so that link is in the back of this presentation. But a basic example, so I thought it might be useful to run through a very basic calculation to show how your duty and import VAT is calculated, and indeed any other duties like excise or anti-dumping. They're based on more than just the price that might appear on your supplier's commercial invoice. So we have here an invoice price of 10,000. We need to add freight and insurance to get to the customs value on which our duty will be calculated. And the customs value plus the applicable duty then gives us our VAT value. So by the time we've calculated the VAT and added it to the subtotal, we're left with a total price to clear the goods at customs that can equate to almost 50% higher than the price of the goods themselves. So it's important that you familiarise yourself with the customs valuation procedure to see what needs to be added in as a cost and what deductions potentially can help in terms of relieving the amount of duty and import VAT that you pay. So currently, when buying goods in from outside the EU, from a country that doesn't operate a free trade agreement with the EU, UK companies would have been paying import duty in line with the EU Common External Tariff. However, as of 1st of January, in the absence of a trade deal, duty and import VAT will be applicable to goods coming in from the EU too, as we discussed. So you have to either pay or account for the duties and taxes to HMRC in order to have your goods released from customs. So the amount of duty that you're required to pay is dependent on the commodity code, which is why it's so important that you get it right, and obviously the volume of your imported goods. That then feeds into your customs value build-up and the declared value of your goods. If you've only ever traded within the EU, all of a sudden having to pay that import duty and VAT on your goods may come as a bit of a shock to your cash flow. So there are some payment options that can assist with this. I'm going to cover these off on the next slide. So if cash flow is not such an issue, or your duty and VAT liability is not so great, you can choose to just pay for your goods at the time they enter the UK using cash, or what's referred to as a flexible accounting system, or you might see it referred to as FAS. We love our acronyms in international trade. A FAS is like a bank current account, but without the overdraft facility, charges or interest. There's also the option of obtaining what we call a duty deferment account. If you import goods regularly, you can apply for a duty deferment account to delay importing VAT, customs duty, or special duty like excise. So a deferment account lets you delay your payments for, on average, 30 days, and it means that you make one payment per month through direct debit instead of paying for individual consignments, which can lead hugely to, a significant admin burden. Duty deferment accounts are a leading facilitation in the government's new border operating model. As I mentioned earlier, UK importers of standard goods could have up until the 1st of July to make their customs declaration. So they have the option of deferring both the duty and VAT until the time that declaration is made. However, in order to do this, they'd have to have a DDA. Otherwise, those import declarations and payment of duty and import VAT would be required from the 1st of January. Some companies are reluctant to apply for DDAs due to the fact that they require a comprehensive customs guarantee, or a CCG, from their bank, which can be difficult to obtain. In recognition of this, HMRC is introducing new rules that will allow almost all businesses to use a duty deferment account without needing to obtain a guarantee. So qualifying companies who are solvent and have a good compliance history with HMRC under the new terms could defer customs duty, import VAT or excise duty up to £10,000 per month without needing a guarantee, which is obviously, really good. Whether you need or whether you'd benefit from a DDA is a decision only you can make. It would certainly allow you to defer those import declarations for EU goods for the beginning half of next year. And it's also a requirement for some of the simplified procedures I referred to earlier, so it's definitely worth considering. I wanted to touch on regulatory compliance, and I'm conscious of the time, so I don't want to go too much into this, but we've been so tightly integrated with the EU over the past 40 years, it's really difficult to detangle our regulation from them. So there are a raft of regulations and directives that might apply to your products and could impact your ability to trade if the UK and the EU don't strike a deal. So things I would mention here are perhaps REACH, which is the EU's registration platform for chemicals coming into the EU. So manufacturers and importers have a duty to register products on this system, but from the 1st of January, GB-based companies currently registered with EU REACH will no longer be able to sell into the EEA market without transferring their registrations to an EU or EEA-based organisation. Again, I make the distinction between UK and GB-based companies because under the Northern Ireland Protocol, the process for businesses in Northern Ireland moving goods to and from the European Union under EU REACH will not change. So GB businesses, if you're a GB business that's affected, you now have to register on the UK REACH platform and then take other action to continue accessing the EU, EEA and UK markets. Leads me on to the CE mark, which is the European certification mark that indicates conformity with health, safety and environmental protection standards for products sold within the EEA. Brexit has implications of where and how that can be applied in the future. So the UK has developed its own UKCA mark, which will be used in the UK from the 1st of January. The CE mark will still be recognised in the UK for the whole of next year before companies have to switch to the new mark. But the UKCA mark will not be recognised in the EU. So there might be a circumstance whereby you need to have a CE mark in order to sell your products into the EU, and you need to have a UKCA mark to have your products sold in the UK. the best course of action really here is to contact the BSI, because they are a notified body based in both, they've got a foot in both territories, so they can apply, they can issue a UK CA mark and also a CE mark as well. So look at their website for further details. GDPR, still a huge sticking point in the EU-UK negotiations. The EU is still determining whether the UK meets its data protection adequacy tests, even though GDPR will be retained in UK domestic law at the end of the transition period. Now, we as a country, or the UK government, has confirmed that data transfers from the UK to the EEA will not be restricted. So there's no further action for you to take there. But where companies are receiving EEA data, they'll need to incorporate a standard contractual clause into their commercial contract. So if that affects you, if you're receiving, processing or storing EEA customer data, then you're best off taking a look at the Commissioner's Office, the Information Commissioner's Office. They're a really good source of information and guidance in this regard, and they can show you the kind of contractual clauses that need to be put into your contracts. Intrastat, as I mentioned earlier, some welcome relief for companies around Intrastat. Post-transition, companies exporting goods and the EU will no longer be required to prepare Intrastat. HMRC will, however, continue to require that all VAT registered importers currently submitting monthly Intrastat arrival declarations, so whether over that 1.5 million threshold, can carry on submitting these just for the whole of next year. Commercial contracts, so some of the terms in your existing contracts with partners or customers may no longer be relevant post-Brexit, or they might raise legal or practical questions in the future. So take a good look at them and check whether they refer to any terms that should be reviewed in light of the UK leaving the EU. Are there any references to the UK being a member state or a member of the EU? Do they rely on any EU regulation being applicable to contractual agreements or arrangements? So take a good look at those contracts if you haven't done already. And then with regard to delivery terms negotiated with customers and suppliers, as I said earlier, most intra-EU trade tends to fall into two door-to-door categories, ex works or the equivalent of what will be delivered duty paid. And these terms were fine when we didn't have those processes and controls, but Brexit brings that additional level of complication. So DDP places the maximum obligation on your supplier or exporter in the same way that Ex Works places maximum burden on you, the buyer. So if your current mode of delivery equates to you taking responsibility for export declarations in those local markets or customs formalities, you might want to reconsider and renegotiate your terms. Local market customs can be highly problematic. They can be complex and bureaucratic, and so really left best to your supplier and their agent that have that local knowledge. Incoterms, just touching on this briefly, so kind of following on from the previous slide, the Incoterms are introduced by the International Chamber of Commerce. They prevent that confusion in foreign trade contracts by clarifying the obligations of the buyers and the sellers. So they remove that ambiguity relating to the tasks, costs and liability. They're often overlooked in EU trade, but their importance has never been as important as it is now. Obviously, at the end of this year, the UK becomes the third country in the eyes of the EU, and therefore goods traded between the UK and the bloc become imports and exports for real. So as we've discussed, those customs declarations become mandatory, and the applicable income terms will be included in that declaration. So the terms you have in place with your EU suppliers currently will have a direct impact on your cost and risk exposure. So you need to take a look at what's in place with your suppliers currently and where your responsibilities and liabilities start and stop. As I said earlier, an Incoterm that requires you to be responsible for goods clearance in the country of supply is not going to be palatable to you. Similarly, Incoterms like DDP that require your supplier to clear the goods in the UK are not really going to be favourable to them either. So you need to start having those discussions if you haven't started already. AEO status. So by satisfying certain criteria, you can become an authorised economic operator. So AEO status is a bit like a kite mark that demonstrates you're both safe and reliable in your customs-related operations, and that allows you to receive certain benefits. So there are two types of AEO, and you can apply for both. One is AEOC for customs regimes, and the other is AEOS for safety and security of your supply chain. So the type of AEO authorization you apply for will determine the benefits you're entitled to, but they can be considerable. So the accreditation is open to importers, exporters, manufacturers, freight forwarders, a wide range of companies. And as I say, the benefits can be significant, ranging from fewer physical and documentary checks at borders and reductions or waivers linked to the comprehensive customs guarantee I mentioned earlier, right the way through to easier access to simplified procedures and reduced incidents of theft or loss in transit through that increased security of your supply chain. The process of obtaining the status can be a bit time consuming. Companies who have obtained ISO 9000 in the past are said to be part of the way there, because many of their processes and procedures will be documented and optimized. But it's certainly worth considering for high volume importers or importers with complex supply chains. So I provided a link at the back of the presentation for that. So how to prepare? We're on the final stretch, folks. How to prepare over the next, what have we got, 60 days? Double check your UK EORI number, find out if you need an EU EORI number. Check those commodity codes. So as I've said, goods coming in will be subject to a lot more scrutiny and checks. The correct classification of your imported goods is your legal responsibility, and it's important in order to avoid delays and costly mistakes and ensure that those declarations are right. Source a customs intermediary. When you find a good one, they're worth their weight in gold, and they'll help you navigate the changes ahead. Simplify procedures. So see if you can use a simplified procedure when you make customs declaration on imports. You may be able to make a simplified declaration when your goods arrive at a UK port or airport. Prepare to pay or account for VAT on goods. So use the UK global tariff to calculate your likely duty and VAT liability. And VAT registered traders will be able to account for their import VAT on their VAT return, as I said, using postponed VAT accounting. Duty deferment account, if you import and you're in good financial health and you have a good compliance history, think about applying for a duty deferment account to defer that duty, excise duty, import VAT, and so on. Controls and licenses. Understand the procedures in place for your product. So do they require an import pre-notification? Do they have to enter via a border control post? Do they require documentary identity and physical checks at the border? Do they need any special certificates or licenses like export health certificates, phytosanitary certificates, or import licenses? So understand, you'll find all this information against your commodity code in the tariff. Familiarise yourself with any regulatory impacts in your sector. So we mentioned REACH, GDPR, but there's a whole host. So your federations and associations are a really good source of information on this. They've probably been lobbying government throughout the last 4 years. So they'll be a really good source of information. In terms of commercial contracts, review them to understand what your obligations are with regard to transport and delivery, and look to renegotiate where Incoterms are just too burdensome or you're bearing just too much risk. Look at hedging as a means of reducing the impact of further sterling volatility and protect those cash flows. Look to mitigate risk around potential customs delays by building a modest stock buffer. And then training and funding to access that training. So even where you've appointed an agent to manage your imports, it remains you who's responsible for correctly declaring those goods, and negligible liability is placed on the agent. So with this in mind, you have to get a good understanding of customs obligations and take steps to ensure compliance. Both the local chambers and the Institute of Export and International Trade are really good sources of accredited training around customs procedures, documentation and compliance. And there's also funding that you can obtain to do this. So HMRC has allocated what must be now in excess of 100 million, yeah, 100 million in terms of funding for recruitment or employee training or IT for those companies that are going to be impacted by additional customs declarations. So again, I've provided the link at the back of this presentation. Oh my word, we're nearly at 1 o'clock. So much to cover with import. So you can see here I have provided all of the links applicable to everything that I've covered today. The local growth hubs are great sources of information. Obviously, you can come directly through to ourselves here. There's so much help out there. It's just a case of understanding where you obtain it. So on that, I'm just going to quickly check and see if we have any Q&As, which it doesn't look like we can. Now that either means that I have put you all to sleep, or I've explained it all very well, or I've lost you all at some point. But if there's no Q&As, then you have my contact details here. By all means, if anything springs to mind after this presentation, or you want to get in touch and book a direct one-to-one to have that dedicated action plan, then just please get in touch and we can arrange that. But if there are no questions or anything in the chat, then I will leave it there. Please revisit the Eventbrite link for future webinars that are coming up, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Okay, thanks ever so much, everyone. Oh, hold on, I have one question. Are we getting a copy of the slides? Yes, if you would like, Abby, that's absolutely fine. I will forward those out. Any more questions from anyone? No worries. Okay, if that's it, then I will say enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. Oh.